What I want to do is actually to share with you the results of my studies that have been conducted in the past around 8 years, focused on EU support to civil society in Central Asia, and in particular in Kyrgyzstan and in Kazakhstan, through different kind of programs. So what we will do today is to look at 3 case studies that I selected. One case study is about the thematic program non-state actors and local authorities in Kyrgyzstan. The second case study is about CSO-LA, so civil society organization local authorities program, plus the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights in Kazakhstan. And then we will take a look at the main outcomes of projects that were implemented in Kyrgyzstan under the instrument contributing to stability and peace. So as I was saying, I have been conducting extensive research in this field and also fieldwork in this field. My studies are based on around 75, a little bit more than 75 semi-structured interviews with EU-funded organizations, plus EU officials in Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, I was in Nur Sultan, I was in Almaty, I was in Kizilorda and in Aktau between 2014 and 2018. And here in Kyrgyzstan, I came once at first time in 2016, and then I completed my fieldwork in 2019. So as you can see, I tried to collect several data, talk to CSOs, EU-funded CSOs in different regions of Kazakhstan. In Kyrgyzstan, it was mainly Bishkek. And I also tried to do it in the course of time so that I could see also if changes in the programs of the EU somehow contributed also in changing the kind of outcomes that CSOs were able to produce on the ground. I had a very positive experience in this field, since the CSOs I've been talking to were very willing to share their own impressions also on the EU programs. They even share with me project evaluations, sometimes for external use, but also sometimes they even shared internal documents, which were very useful for me to grasp really all the dynamics and the developments taking place. And then last year I also started conducting an online survey with CSOs here in Kyrgyzstan to understand a little bit more about also the impact of COVID on the development of the sector. So I was talking about the first case study. Somehow my screen is, oh, now I can do that. Okay, the first case study I would like to present today is focused on the thematic program non-state actors and local authorities in development, which was implemented in Kyrgyzstan between 2007 and 2013. I think you all kind of are aware of EU funding, and you probably know that this program was replaced by a new program in 2014 in the field of civil society and local authorities. The new title, there are some slight changes, but I would say that the substance per se has not changed so much. Anyway, the first study I conducted was about the NSA-LA, which was focused between 2007 and 2013 on poverty reduction in the context of sustainable development through the involvement of all segments of society. This is a very actor-oriented program and has really the aim of stimulating local ownership on behalf of local organizations, local civil society organizations engaged in the delivery of services. We are all talking about here grant programs. So these are EU programs for civil society organizations providing grants. In the first study I considered, so between 2007 and 2013, I had 6 different calls of the program that I included in my research and 15 projects that I basically analyzed. On the bottom of this slide, you can see the article where I published all the findings of this study. I'm not going to share them. The details today, my findings are very detailed, so I really collected a lot of information on the number of activities, and the number of participants, and so on. I don't want to share them with you today. You will get a very general overview of the kind of study I conducted and the kind of outcomes these projects, let's say, created. So here I provided a table also with indicative budget for the program, the overall program that, as you can see, between 2008 and 2013 remained pretty constant. So what I did in my study was to use a specific theoretical approach. What I wanted to understand was whether the NSA-LA program in Kyrgyzstan was able to sustain development. And I asked myself, what kind of development? And I took from the literature this very interesting distinction between big D approach to development and little d approach to development. So big T approach to development sees development as a technical problem to be solved without addressing the social and economic inequalities necessary for better representation of and accountability to the disadvantaged group. So basically, big T approach to development sees development as a technical issue. On the other hand, we have the little d approach to development, which sees development as the result of a long-term structural process requiring also radical and systemic alternatives that need to be introduced and that affect the ways in which societies organize the economy, social relationships, and politics. It might be a little bit theoretical when I'm talking about approaches, but my aim for you today is also to familiarize with some theoretical approaches that might be used also in the conceptualization of new projects and maybe programs in the future. So what I discovered through my study is that the organization CSOs funded by the EU under the NSA-LA basically we're engaged in the provision of services in three main fields. We have the provision of services related to basic needs. We have the provision of services in terms of capacity building through training education activities aimed at raising awareness, but also raising skills and organizational, let's say, capability of individuals and of organizations. And the third important function was the support to community-level initiatives in terms of mobilizations of individuals and communities and organizations, so initiative groups especially, the networking between individuals and between organizations, and the creation of federations, so organizations coming together, basically. So if I have to describe in general the outcomes of this program, I can see that we have some positive outcomes on the ground. One very good example is, for instance, the idea of creating, let's say, new synergies between new and old structures at the grassroots levels. As you know, the literature is always criticizing international donor programs for creating a sort of mushrooming of organizations. What I saw in this specific cause and in these specific programs was at least an attempt to create new synergies, to merge new and old structures, and also an attempt to work at the meso level. So instead of focusing only on the individual level, at the micro level, there was an attempt to kind of scale it up. Okay, so for instance, there was a training of individuals who were requested also to act as a multipliers, provide additional trainings in this field. At the same time, the impression that I got was that the program was still using the so-called big T approach to development. So sustainable development and poverty reduction was still seen as a more technical issue. The projects implementing this field were not really able to, let's say, tackle the political dimension of poverty, of maybe marginalization, of discrimination affecting specific target groups. And in general, the initiatives were also too limited and too fragmented. So 2 years project duration is very, very little. And they were also very spread in the country to be able to create some sort of sustainable change. So my conclusion was that yes, the program between 2007 and 2013, the NSCLA program was at the one hand able to go a little bit beyond this big T of development, but still the outcomes were too limited to spread in the country, not so, let's say, homogeneous and coherent to sustain real change. The second case study I would like to present today is about NSCLA program plus the new program CSO-LA plus the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights in Kazakhstan. So I will not introduce the NSCLA again. As I was saying, CSO-LA is a very similar program. About the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, I'm pretty sure you are very familiar with that, but for maybe the audience at home, this is a program aimed at supporting, developing and consolidating democracy in third country, enhancing participatory and representative democracy. It's about rule of law, it's about improving reliability of the electoral process, and foresees, as for the NSCLA and the CSO-LAs, grants that are awarded to civil society organizations. What I did in this second study was to use the notion of social capital. So the question that I asked myself was, to what extent are the projects implemented in Kazakhstan with the support of the EU in the framework of the NSCLA, CSO-LA, and European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, to what extent are these projects able to create new social capital? And I'm not sure if you are familiar with the topic of social capital, but social capital is a very interesting concept that was very popular in the 90s, was popular in the academic debate, but was also popular among practitioners, with the World Bank using this concept and developing this concept in the framework of the Social Capital Initiative. For some reasons that I cannot explain now, otherwise we would need a couple of hours to discuss this issue. Social capital, the notion was a little bit abandoned, but I do believe that there are a lot of interesting insights coming from the notion of social capital, the implication of these concepts, that could be useful also for programming and implementation of development initiatives. So in my research, I defined social capital as features of social life, networks, norms, and trust that enable participants to act together more efficiently, to pursue shared objectives. And in my study, I used firstly 2 dimensions and then 3 dimensions of social capital. This is a little bit the difference compared to the World Bank Social Capital Initiative, which was based only on 2 dimensions, the structural and the cognitive dimension. In my study, I added an additional dimension, which is the relational dimension. So here I provided also some information on papers, 1 paper and 1 chapter, where I presented the main results of this study. And I just want briefly to reflect on you on the importance of this dimension and on how I actually collected my data on the ground. So in my research, I defined the structural dimension of social capital as the patterns of connection among individuals and the links that form the organizational network. When I look at the structural social capital created by EU-funded projects, I look at the actors which were involved in this project as implementers, as partners, as target groups, as beneficiaries. And in this context, I also took a look at, let's say, the kind of links that were created, not just the networks that was created, but also the kind of links. Looking at the bonding, bridging, and linking component, asking myself, are we linking similar individuals? Are we linking different individuals? And what kind of power do these individuals have? The second dimension, the cognitive dimension, is about the norms, is about the knowledge, the information, the heuristic, the interpretation, the system of meanings that these projects were able to sustain. So we are talking about values, we're talking about, for instance, human rights, which human rights? And yes, and I tried to figure out what kind of values, what kind of norms were promoted and how were they created, how were they spread, and how they were circulated. And finally, I took a look at the relational dimension. So the kind of, let's say, relations created by all these actors, right, the networks of actors involved in the EU-funded projects, and the quality of the relations is very important to be able to predict whether these projects are able to create also obligation and expectation, trust and trustworthiness, and identity and identification, which ensure the projects themselves sort of sustainability also after their formal completion. I know it's a lot of information, sounds very theoretical, but it's a very useful tool if you are analyzing, kind of evaluating these projects on the ground, and also if you are conceptualizing this project, you could take into account these different dimensions when you are conceptualizing your own initiative. What I discovered as a result of my second case studies is that the EU-funded projects in Kyrgyzstan, they were able to create new structural social capital. So what I saw is that in this framework, there was, for instance, a huge number of conferences, of events, of forums, of seminars that were organized. And all these activities were able to link different kinds of actors. They were able to link civil society actors, business sector, non-state actors, but also state actors at the local and national level. Even the representatives of the business sector attended this event, and it was very interesting to see the kind of network that was created by all these events and all these conferences. I also saw that the project funded by the EU contributed in the creation of new interpretation, new narratives, new representation, new system of meanings concerning different topics such as local development, active citizenship, civic engagement, local self-governance, and so on. And what was very interesting is that the meanings were created not, let's say, top-down, but all these events offered an opportunity for people to come together and to jointly discuss all this topic, to jointly participate in the creation of meanings. And what my study revealed is that, however, the relational dimension was the missing dimension of these projects. So basically, all these activities, of course, succeeded in creating new networks and in bringing people together to discuss new meanings, to localize new meanings, to localize norms and values, but very often we had a very instrumental participation. Probably you have the same kind of experience also when you are implementing your own trainings. People come because of the kind of advantages they think they have, getting a certificate. You don't see them engaging afterwards. So they are engaged in the discussion about the meanings, but they don't engage afterwards. It is very difficult to create a sense of identification. And in my opinion, this is also related to the kind of activities you organize. Very often, very short activities are not able to create a sense of commitment. So maybe there is a need of new formats to make sure that the discussion continues and is sustainable also after the end of a training or the end of a project. I don't know how much time I have. 10 minutes. Okay, so I was too fast. No, I still have my third case study. The third case study is about the instrument contributing to stability and peace here in Kyrgyzstan. So this is an instrument replacing the instrument for stability. And between 2014 and 2020, we had a budget over 2 billion euros. It's a very substantial instrument. And the instrument per se foresees three kind of assistance: a short-term response under Article 3. This is a response to situations of crisis or emerging crisis to prevent conflict. We have Article 4, long-term response to conflict prevention, peace building, and crisis preparedness. And Article 5, which is also long-term response for addressing global and transnational threats. What I did in my study was to take a look at the instrument contributing to stability and peace in Kyrgyzstan at the projects implemented between 2017 and 2019. And what I figured out is that in this time frame, 5 projects were implemented with EU financial support. 4 had a national focus, 1 had a regional focus. And there was also another initiative, the so-called STRIVE program with 3 projects, national projects implemented in the country in this period. STRIVE is a program that is funded under the instrument Contributing to Stability and Peace and is managed by an organization called EIDHR. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that. Anyway, so what I did in my analysis was to look at 8 projects, the kind of outcomes characterizing these projects on the ground. And here we are with a very brief overview of the different kind of functions, different kind of contributions that EU-funded organization provided in the field of prevention of violent extremism. What was very relevant and very interesting at that time is that we were in this phase, in this very strong PVE bubble, let's call it bubble. So since 2016, as you might know, there have been a lot of funding available for projects and initiatives in the field of PVE. And this was reflected also in the kind of projects that were funded by the EU in the framework of the instrument Contributing to Stability and Peace. And organizations receiving money under this scheme basically were engaged in developing and delivering capacity building seminars and trainings that were sometimes related to VE, to violent extremism, but most of the time they were very general. They were about I don't know, computer literacy, about gender rights, women rights. So very general, let's say, focus of these capacity building seminars. The second important function was the establishment of mechanism of dialogue, consultation and advocacy. Third function was research and research capacity building that was conducted by CSOs funded by the EU in different fields. We had some research on violent extremism, on the role of women especially, in recruiting people. It was about, however, also religion, the role of religion, and in a democracy. So we had a huge, let's say, spectrum of topics that were investigated in this framework. The fourth function was the production and circulation of counter narratives and alternative narratives. This was very much VE oriented. And the fifth function was the sub-granting of smaller scales and or community level project. Once again, very general focus. And this is all what I call forms of engagement in the PVE field. So the topics were PVE related, but not necessarily, let's say, dealing with the issue of violent extremism. What I also found on the ground here, as you can see, the analysis is much more detailed than what I'm saying right now. I don't want you to get lost in all this, but you can take a look at the forthcoming paper, which will be published very soon if you're interested in learning something more about the peculiarities of all these activities. So what I also want to share as last point was a side result of my research. So I basically conducted my project in order to figure out what kind of roles, what kind of functions characterize CSOs funded by the EU under the instrument Contributing to Stability and Peace. And what I figured out was the large use of processes of reappropriation. So basically, I saw that this program was interpreted and understood by CSOs on the ground in very different ways. There was a sort of rejection also of the idea of VE and PVE. Most of the organizations I was talking to, they were not very, let's say, keen on working in this field, and they didn't completely believe that this field was relevant for Kyrgyzstan, was a priority for Kyrgyzstan. And through their words, I could distinguish, and through the interviews, I could distinguish 3 kind of mechanisms through which they try to reappropriate, to localize these projects: adaptation, reinterpretation, and contestations. And adaptation, I could see, for instance, that some organizations, some local organizations, small organizations, they were not really able to, let's say, use explicit means to go against what the funders, international donor community wanted from them. So basically, they were just adjusting the projects to the new focus. They were doing the same kind of activities as in the past, but introducing a VE lens. This is how they framed it. The second mechanism, the reinterpretation, was, for instance, there when the organization were describing the translation process of their own projects. So the use of different languages when they talk to the international donor community, the national, let's say, state actors and their local beneficiaries on the ground, and how they adapted the title of their projects and the content of the projects according to the stakeholders they were talking to. And then I also discovered some example of contestation where basically organizations were saying, no, we don't do what we are asked to. Yes, we got the money, but we don't believe that VE is a relevant issue for our country. We will continue doing our work as in the past. Looking more at, let's say, ending discrimination and stigmatization of specific minorities in the country, rather than looking at the issue of VE per se. And yeah, the problem with the processes of reappropriation is that if on the one hand, they are a very good example of how NGOs in Kyrgyzstan, but not only in Kyrgyzstan, can somehow localize international funding. There are also some issues related to the misappropriation or, let's say, perpetuation of inappropriate development intervention, which means that if you're using these mechanisms and you don't have any way to talk to your donor and kind of to provide feedback that what the donor is funding is not relevant for the country, the donor will continue funding the same kind of projects that you don't consider relevant. And the scheme were repeated and repeated. So if on the one hand, this is a very good way to localize these programs to make them relevant for the local context, at the other hand, you have some risks related to the fact that the donors will not notice that they are financing things which are not relevant for local beneficiaries. And I'm done with my presentation now. I prepared some questions, but of course I look forward to hearing also your question. So the first question that I have is about this big D development and little d development approach. How would you agree that the EU funding promotes especially, or is able to promote especially these big D development, seeing developments more technical issue and not a political, let's say, issue? And yeah, what kind of funding scheme would be, in your opinion, more or best suited to promote the little d of development also in the human rights fields? The second question I have is about local ownership. How can this local ownership, a form which is not, let's say, taking place secretly as the mechanism of reappropriation that I was presenting, how can local ownership, real direct local ownership, be supported? What kind of formats are also necessary there? What kind of interaction mechanisms are necessary in order to make sure that CSOs on the ground can provide real feedback? And finally, how to make sure that your support of human rights through civil society actually reaches the local community and real people and is targeted to their needs and priorities. Again, it's about interaction mechanism, not just between local NGOs and international donors, but also between local beneficiaries and international donors via civil society organization. Thank you.